that if you haven't heard this yet, I don't think, but we have a YouTube account set up, South Plains Chapter Texas Master Naturalist. And if you subscribe to that account, you can find the training videos. Kippy uploaded those training videos that have been done and are available to watch for training. So check into that. I would subscribe and use those if you haven't viewed one or more of them. We're gonna call a trash cleanup next weekend, next Saturday at the Landmark, and I'll send some information out about that this week, but wanted to do it today, but I think it's gonna be too windy. So hopefully we can get together next weekend, next Saturday, for a brief time at the Landmark. This morning, we're going to learn about urban ecosystems. Our guest speaker is a friend of mine. I really appreciate Jared doing this for us today. I'm going to read his bio to you so you'll know. Jared is an instructor in the Department of Landscape Architecture at Texas Tech University and a part-time landscape designer at Park Hill Inc. Growing up on a cotton farm near Hale Center, Texas, Jared developed a deep connection with the land and its cycles that has directed his passions throughout his life. His projects and research include investigations of the hydrology of urban playa lakes and planning design work at the new Buddy Holly Hall of Performing Arts and Sciences. At his core, Jared is a plant and design nerd who thinks the way we shape our cities and the spaces we build within them can do so much more to balance nature and provide beautiful, meaningful, and resilient places to share our existence. So Jared, I'm going to turn things over to you and get you to share your screen and we'll get going. Thank you again.
Great, thank you, Glenda, and thank y'all for having me this morning. So let me get this pulled up and we will get going really quickly. There we go. Do y'all see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so this morning I'm going to talk about urban ecosystems and a framework that a lot of landscape architects and other urban designers use that's helping us to hopefully do a better job than we've done in the past at how we think about urban ecosystems and designing for a little bit better systems than what we've maybe done in the past. And that's a framework called ecosystem services, which you may have come across in some of your other talks, but really looking at what urbanization does to our natural ecosystems and kind of some of my thoughts on how we plan and design in ways that maybe remedy some of those things. So from the textbook, just some of the points that I want to make sure we hit on, and then I'll kind of talk a little more broadly about some of these things, is just the unit goals, kind of defining some of the terms about what we mean about urban ecosystems and urbanization and sprawl, how we compare urban and natural ecosystems in terms of their diversity, interrelationship, cycles, and energy, and then understanding the unique ecology of urban ecosystems, how they impact the abiotic characteristics of the ecosystems, nutrient cycles and water cycles, the distinction between green and gray spaces, and then plants and animals. And then lastly, determining our levels of biodiversity in urban ecosystems versus natural ecosystems. So when we talk about the ecology of urban places, we may have a specific picture that comes to mind. A lot of times we may think of something like an urban park, but really when we talk about urban ecosystems, we're not just talking about green spaces where maybe we've tried to design a space for nature, but we're really talking about the ecosystem that fully encompasses cities, towns, and urban strips, and essentially any place that's constructed by humans. And we're talking about their ecological functions, both as self-contained units, but also talking about the effects that they have on landscapes that they interact with. So one of the biggest impacts of urban ecosystems is not just what happens within the city, but how that begins to affect the cycles of climate and microclimate, water cycles, and storm flow characteristics downstream and things like that, that aren't necessarily urban, but are impacted by those urban ecosystems. So we find urban ecosystems in a lot of different places. We definitely see them in designed landscapes. So places like suburban residential districts here in the top left-hand corner, places that are urban parks. So this bottom left corner is Clyde Warren Park in Dallas, which is actually a what's called a freeway deck park, which is essentially an overpass over the Woodall Rogers Freeway that has been developed into a park rather than just a vehicular overpass. And then even in some cities, we're starting to see the development of infrastructural easements into green spaces. And so while we may think of these places that are kind of intentionally designed as part of the ecosystem, we also find ecosystems in, or ecosystems include rather the not designed parts, or kind of the residual spaces. So here in the top left, the empty lots or agricultural fields that are next to residential development. Weeds growing in what we would consider weeds growing in sidewalks. Those are part of urban ecosystems. And sometimes the most biologically diverse areas are these undesigned areas. So places like alleyways sometimes contribute a lot of ecosystem function. Might not be much to look at. And this image here is actually probably not a great example because it's all, the weeds in this alleyway are all invasive non-native kochia. But a lot of times we'll find alleys where we have kind of ecosystem remnants because of the lack of maintenance that's gone in rather than the intention of the design. So really when we talk about urban ecosystems, it's not just, New York City. We're talking about cities, we're talking about suburbs, we're talking about industrial areas. We're talking about all of the kind of infrastructural easements, all of those parts. So when we look at how these systems differ, a really good acronym that I actually became familiar with from the textbook that Glenda shared with me was the idea of DICE. So the differences in diversity, in interrelationships, in cycles, and in energy. So real briefly, just kind of talk about each one of these. One of the biggest places that we see differences in urban versus natural ecosystems is in terms of diversity. So in this region, our native ecosystem is centered around the shortgrass prairie. So here on the left, we have shortgrass prairie plant matrix, where we have a mix of several different species of grasses and forbs, some subshrubs, and lots of different species that would support wildlife that are also adapted to that ecosystem. And on the right, we have an image, obviously not Lubbock, I don't know, especially not Lubbock this year with the lack of rain that we had, but kind of a stereotypical suburban front lawn landscape where we have monoculture of turf grass and some ornamental plant beds that are probably mostly populated by exotic plants, or at least non-native ornamental plants, and probably heavily maintained with a lot of chemical inputs as well. But we can also compare the diversity of the native ecosystem to industrial areas. So not necessarily a designed landscape, but still a built urban area. And, we look at this landscape and we don't necessarily think of it as being terribly healthy, and that's probably accurate, but we can see that there are plants, there's a high level of disturbance, but there are plants that are coming in. They're still doing the work that plants do of photosynthesis and carbon sequestration and all those kinds of things. And in this region, one thing that's, I think, important to note, and may not be surprising to y'all, but we typically think of rural areas, agricultural areas, as being somehow better than cities. But if we're looking at it in terms of diversity, oftentimes industrial agricultural practices are probably at the bottom of this gradient from diversity, bottom of the gradient of diversity, because here we have massive acreages of heavily chemically managed monocultures that are really, very kind of sterile in terms of their biologic function, apart from, just that plant being grown. So along that gradient, we could think of kind of this trajectory of industrial agriculture to other industry, to design kind of suburban lots back to native landscapes. And I'll touch on this a little bit more whenever I get to kind of discussion of tying this into some of the research and work that I've done. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about the region that we live in, even though the native shortgrass prairie is kind of the original ecosystem, because of the widespread agriculture that developed in the 20th century here, there's very, very few remnants of kind of virgin prairie that have not been modified by human use in some way that exists around here. So, and that's pretty much the entire Llano Estacado region. So in some ways, when we're talking about biodiversity, this alleyway might actually be more biologically vital, more biologically functioning than these other landscapes that are heavily managed in different ways. We also look at the interrelationships, and these are the connections that obviously exist in any ecosystem, but in urban ecosystems, we have some different functions and how they relate. So we typically break these down into abiotic and biotic categories. So abiotic referring to the non-living elements, so things like water, sunlight, our atmosphere and precipitation, our soils, things like that. Biotic being the living component, so plants, animals, microorganisms, and even the organic matter that they leave behind that becomes a critical component of the soil. Some of the ways that these things change in an urban ecosystem is the imbalance of inputs that can throw outputs out of balance as well. So we could look at the interrelationship abiotic to abiotic. So we could look at the way that urban heat island effect, which is the effect where urban areas and all of the man-made materials that are here absorb heat during the day and re-radiate it in the evening and keep temperatures kind of artificially elevated, how those effects influence climate patterns at a larger scale. So there's some research that shows that urban areas in the summer can actually create essentially a high pressure bubble that defers or deflects precipitation systems around that kind of heat bubble around the cities. We can look at the relationships of biotic to biotic or abiotic to biotic. So looking at how the modifications in our plant communities in our design landscapes change the animals that are supported, or more often not supported, that would be native to this region. Although sometimes that trade-off is different. So if we look at the city of Lubbock in this region, we don't have a whole lot of trees that exist native, especially in kind of the areas in the kind of flatlands. And the introduction of trees in urban areas does increase some biodiversity of certain species like birds and small mammals that probably wouldn't be here otherwise. So just noting that these interrelationships change what's naturally here. It's not always a net negative, but it is definitely different from studying kind of the balanced climax communities that we would see in a natural ecosystem that was kind of left to its own devices. Then one of the biggest things that happens with urban ecosystems is the change in our cycles. With our nutrient cycles, we have kind of two effects that happen. We can either have the effect of too much of a good thing, and this is especially true when we're talking about our nitrogen, our phosphorus, the nutrients that we use to fertilize our landscapes that have been designed. So when we apply a standard landscape fertilizer, we're putting in a lot of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, things like that. And we're not really contributing, we're taking those out of a place where they would be cycled naturally in the ecosystem and concentrating them, usually at levels higher than what the plants actually need. And so that concentration throws the cycle out of whack, both in the city, but also wherever we extracted that material from in the first place. The other problem with this is that it is a one-way trip usually. Nitrogen, unfortunately, is not usually a one-way trip. Oftentimes nitrogen gets washed out into our waterways and causes algal blooms in our waterways and eutrophication, which can be really negative to aquatic ecosystems, kind of deoxygenating the water and causing a lot of fish kills and aquatic wildlife kills and things like that. But when we look at some of our less mobile nutrients, so things like phosphorus, which is pretty much derived from rock sources, we're depriving that phosphorus from a natural cycle and kind of concentrating it and not recontributing it back into the process. When we talk about, oh, did I somehow delete? Oh, I got those out of order, so I'll backtrack to the next one, sorry. When we talk about the hydrologic cycle, what we're really dealing with is a disruption of certain parts of this. Obviously, when we urbanize an area, we build a lot of surfaces that water can't penetrate, things like roofs of our buildings, roadways, parking lots. Even our managed turf grass doesn't soak in water the way a native plant community would. It doesn't hold as much water. And so when we move into an urban area, here in the top left, we see a kind of natural ground cover in that type of vegetation community. Our rainfall that falls, we would have about 50% of that water would soak into the ground. And then we'd have about 10% runoff and about 40% evapotranspiration. Maybe a bit more than that here in Lubbock because of our heat. But the difference between that and a really heavily urbanized area where we have 3/4 to 100% of the land cover that's become impervious, we have very little, only about 15% of that water soaks in. And then the rest of that, the majority of that ends up running off and then some evaporating as well. That's where we end up with a lot of problems with flooding. Obviously, that's a threat to property damage, but with that, we also cause a lot of problems to natural ecosystems that are tied to kind of this runoff. Both the volume of water and the speed with which it hits that system can cause a lot of erosion that disrupts banks of river systems or cuts channels that are not properly shaped for aquatic wildlife. But in addition to that, we're carrying pollution, hydrocarbon pollution, so residues from oil and gas and tires on our roadways get picked up and carried into these ecosystems. But one of the biggest challenges is also temperature or heat pollution in our water system. So these as the water hits these heated pavements, especially during the summer, it heats up, and when this big flush hits the water system, it raises the overall temperature and can cause a lot of die-offs of certain kind of temperature dependent species, and really open up the way for either invasive species or just kind of dead zones in our ecosystems as well. And then let me backtrack here to the energy. And really the differences in energy are just where urban ecosystems and natural ecosystems derive their energy. When we're looking at most natural ecosystems, these are driven by the sun and by photosynthesis, and that's kind of the origination of all of the energy within that, and then that's cycled through the trophic levels of the food web, and then back into the nutrient cycle through decomposition and all of that. But in an urban ecosystem, we have heavy inputs of energy, usually most commonly in the form of fossil fuels to generate electricity or to power our automobiles. And just that difference in inputs of energy helps contribute to the different ways that the ecosystem functions. Instead of being wholly dependent on the sun for the function, we're really inputting these fuels in a way that kind of sustain different parts of the ecosystem and damage other parts. So a lot of those things touch on the differences of what we have in a natural versus an urban ecosystem. And so as a designer, one of the things that I always ask myself is with any project is how can we fix the problem? And if we're looking at the problems that are associated with urban ecosystems, we have a lot of different problems to fix. Because this is a question a lot of landscape architects and designers have asked themselves, there has been a framework that's developed that was a conjunction between the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, the American Society of Landscape Architects, and the United States Botanic Garden. And this is a program that's known as the Sites V2 rating system, which is part of a program called the Sustainable Sites Initiative. And this was a program that was created to promote sustainable design practices that uses ecosystem services as a framework. And I'll talk about that term in just a second. The purpose of this is that this system could be generalized and applied across a wide range of landscape types. So when we talk about ecosystem services, this is, a lot of people have contention with this definition because of the focus on ecosystems providing things for people. And while I understand kind of the problematic nature of that, ecosystems are valuable even when they don't provide things for us. When we're talking about urban landscapes, the justifications that are tied to politics and budgets and things like that that come into different jurisdictions tied to development, oftentimes we have to prove those benefits of ecosystems and their services to the stakeholders on a project. So an ecosystem service is any positive benefit that wildlife or ecosystem provides to people. And the global millennium, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment broke these ecosystem services into 4 categories called provisioning services, supporting services, regulating services, and cultural services. So provisioning are essentially those things that the landscape provides for us. So how landscapes or ecosystems provide food or wood and fiber or fuel, how they give us sources of water. The supporting services are the things that support the stability of the ecosystem. So how nutrients are cycled, or how soils are formed, and how habitats are created. Regulation are just those things, exactly like I said, that kind of help maintain regular functions. So how climate is regulated by ecosystems, water is purified, floods are mitigated. And then the cultural services is really kind of those things that humans value at kind of a cultural or a personal level. So what are the things that ecosystems provide for us in terms of spiritual or aesthetic enrichment, or educational or recreational benefits? And by using this framework, landscape architects and other designers are able to not only recognize what our projects are dealing with in terms of ecosystems whenever we are proposing changes to the landscape, but also designing in such a way that reintroduces those functions that may be lost in the design of the built environment around us within our design. And I used this framework whenever I worked on my master's thesis project, which was looking at urban playa lakes, specifically here in Lubbock, but within kind of the Playa Lake region of the Great Plains in general. And so I just want to talk a little bit about that research and how, kind of as an example of how this framework of ecosystem services in light of urban ecosystems could maybe start to hit home for us. I know, I'm sure Glenda is not the only one among y'all, but I know that Glenda is a huge fan of the Playa Lakes in this area. Some of this also applies to our Canyon Lakes Park system in terms of how that's, even though that has a lot of ecosystem functions with it, it is generally a very urban ecosystem. It's completely manufactured in its own way. So just a little background on Playa Lakes and their importance. So here on the Llano Estacado alone, which is just this lower gray area that kind of encompasses Amarillo, Lubbock, Midland, Odessa, and over into eastern New Mexico, we have over 19,000 playa lakes in the Llano Estacado. And this large red outline is the boundaries of an organization that's called the Playa Lakes Joint Venture that does research and advocacy for the restoration of playa lakes. And this is the region with the highest concentration. And the other important thing about playa lakes here is the Ogallala Aquifer, which is where we get the majority of our groundwater from here in the Llano Estacado. Playa lakes are the only source of recharge for the Llano Estacado, while other parts of the Ogallala north of the Canadian River Valley up in the Panhandle are recharged from the outwash of the Rocky Mountains. The Canadian River Valley actually cuts off most of the horizontal flow of that water. And so what we're actually doing when we tap groundwater here is we're essentially mining historic water resources. It's not groundwater that's being recharged. And even though the playa lakes can contribute water, it's at a much slower rate than what we're currently taking out. So protecting that small source of input becomes increasingly critical. We also look at how the hydrology of the playa lakes and the hydrology of the Llano Estacado as a whole is so different. So this is a map of stream flow systems. This red outline is the Llano Estacado, and everything outside of that is kind of off the caprock, as we would say. And you can see that just the absence of streams in this area almost give us an outline of how water flows here. And we don't have a lot of stream networks. So when we talk about preserving aquatic ecosystems in this region, a lot of people who are trained to look at the stream flow systems might look at our region and say, well, there's not much to protect. But when we look at these systems, this is a map that's called a digital elevation model. And in this, we have darker values that are lower elevation and higher values that are, or lighter values that are higher elevation. This is a close-up of an area just northwest of Lubbock, kind of zoomed in, and we can see these playa lakes very clearly in the terrain model, but also we can see that they form these linear systems that in extreme rainfall events do flow over land from these kind of dimples, and these are connected systems. We tend to think of them as isolated, but they really are interconnected, and those connections are really critically important in how they function. It's also important to understand kind of those abiotic components, so how the topography and the soils of a playa lake contribute to its functions. So really a playa lake, or the playa lake systems, are made up of four main parts. You have the bottom of the playa lake, which is a really specific endemic soil type that's known as Randall clay. And it's a highly expansive clay that shrinks and swells to really large degree as it's hydrated by storm water and inundated, and then cracks deep. Sometimes these cracks can run as deep as 3 meters or 9 to 10 feet deep. And when in the dry season, these cracks open up. Outside of that, in a ring around the playa lake, we have an area known as the annulus, and this is essentially the area that is kind of the top of the water level in a normal, in a normal kind of storm flow event or a normal kind of rain season. Outside of that, we have the expanded floodplain, where you get frequent kind of flood and drought cycles, where the basin will expand and the waters will slowly recede as there's infiltration and evaporation. And then everything outside of that, the area between playas, is known as the interplaya region. And so this playa here is actually in a urban open space at the Fountain Hills development, or Pecan Ridge development, which is near 114th and Juneau in Southwest Lubbock. And it's actually better preserved than many of the urban playas that we have in Lubbock. And because of that, it's actually dry much more of the season. These systems are, in their natural function, supposed to flood and dry out. And the plant communities and the ecosystems that have evolved to thrive in these kind of flood and drought cycles really rely on that cycle and not being permanently flooded like we see in most urban playa lakes. So the functions that we have with these playas, so in the inner playa region, we really don't get a lot of infiltration. Most of the water, we'll get infiltration, but not deep infiltration or percolation. Most of that water is captured by the native ecosystem plants that are really efficiently at harvesting that water. But any runoff flows through the floodplain over the annulus and into the basin. And here on the far left, we can see those cracks that really allow an early flush of water to access kind of the process that begins that slow percolation down towards the aquifer. And as that clay hydrates, that closes up and allows the basin to fill. And once that basin fills, it's really the annulus where we get most of that percolation and infiltration that's so important to our hydrologic cycle here. We also have a high evaporation potential because these are broad, shallow bodies of water. And then outside of that annulus region, we don't get as much of the infiltration, but that variable margin where we have flooding and drying cycles, that's really where the biodiversity of the playa lakes comes in. And so when we look at the various ecosystem services that these playas provide, in terms of kind of the definitions of these, kind of human-centric approach to defining these. Playas obviously collect and store our floodwaters. They do provide aquifer recharge, but that's usually negated in developed areas. They have the ability to improve water quality because of the vegetation that filters the water as it flows, but also the Randall clay is really good at trapping certain chemicals and metals that would be carried in the water and filtering some of those as they flow down into the aquifer. And then because there's water, we have more biomass production, which means we're holding more carbon and we're getting more biodiversity. And then one of the things about the entire Playa Lakes region is it's a really critical component to the Great American Flyway, providing key habitat for both native but also for migratory species. When we look at urban Playa Lakes, which is what we're probably more familiar with, all of Lubbock's kind of stormwater management is built on sites that would have naturally been Playa Lakes, but they've been highly modified. And while it's really easy to recognize the modifications that these urban Playa Lakes have in terms of being excavated to increase the water holding volume and kind of decrease the horizontal spread to kind of limit flooding of residential areas. One interesting thing and kind of tragic thing that I discovered in my research is that almost every single Playa Lake in the Llano Estacado has been negatively altered either by urbanization or by agricultural practices that either till the Playa Lakes, which disrupts the structure of the Randall clay and reduces that infiltration capacity, or through kind of pitting to provide concentrated water sources for livestock, things like that. And a lot of the better preserved Playa Lakes that we have do exist in kind of conservation lands like the CRP or the Swamp Buster programs. But because Playa Lakes are not often recognized as designated wetlands by different government bodies, they're often not protected under those same programs as well. But the worst of the worst is our urban systems, where we do have these highly modified concentrated systems that are increasingly become permanent water bodies that don't have that ebb and flow cycle that provides the changes that we need at that margin. And the annulus and the Randall clay are typically completely destroyed in these systems. So this is just a map that I made in the research. So these three kind of blue areas that we see here working left to right, this is the Playa Lake at Maxey Park near Covenant Hospital. This middle one is Tech Terrace Park in Tech Terrace. And this far right one is Stumpy Hamilton Park in the Heart of Lubbock neighborhood. And even though these are tied to urban storm drain systems that keep these kind of flowing out towards the Yellow House Canyon, this elevation model, I was able to look at what the flooding of these would be if those storm sewers didn't exist. And we can see here really clearly illustrated how these begin to connect one to the next. So the Maxey Park Playa definitely flows toward the Tech Terrace Playa Lake, and these areas are meant to be much more expansively flooded. And so you can just see the level of alteration from this kind of natural flood zone that would occur to what we've kind of limited it to now. So to kind of further this, I wanted to look a little bit more at stormwater and how our changes in urbanization affect these playa systems and their ecosystems tied to them. So I picked a watershed in South Lubbock. This is known as the City of Woodrow watershed, but you can see it goes essentially from 6282 running all the way over to I-27 and beyond. And within this larger watershed, there were 59 playa basins that I then mapped how they would flow one to the next if they were to overflow. And taking that data, I modeled if this were all still native grassland, and we got our 100-year storm, which is a 6.5-inch rain intensity, or a 500-year storm, which is over an 8-inch rainfall intensity. In those models, only 4 of these playa lakes would overflow if this were all still native grassland. But if we put this in low density suburban development, which is what this area is kind of headed towards, then even with a 2-inch rainfall, which is our 10-year storm event here, we start to see here that many more of these playas are overflowing just at a low density development level. And as we start moving this up into our 100-year storm, which is that 6.5 rainfall intensity, we start to see not only that these are overflowing, but they start to form this kind of cascading flow of one playa to the next. And this is where we end up with kind of the property damage issues of urban kind of playa lakes flooding.
I have a question.
Yes.
Does that explain why Lubbock was primarily built north of where you mapped all that? Or, were they trying to avoid flooding, or?
I think that, well, so that system is indicative of pretty much where Lubbock is built now. I don't know if who I'm talking to was around in the was around Lubbock in the late 90s.
I wasn't.
You were not?
I wasn't, no.
Okay. So in the late 90s, there was a major rainfall event, one of those 500-year storms that flooded essentially the entire South Loop from the South Plains Mall, and all of those series of playa lakes that we looked at. Actually, it's this same series of playa lakes here. So the mall is kind of right off the screen over here. This entire area was underwater for months. And the area of the South Plains Mall right near kind of that low area near the Olive Garden, that area was flooded for over close to or over a year. And because of the amount of property damage from that, the city installed a series of stormwater drains that connected the playas essentially at a floating level, so that they would only fill to a certain degree and then flow to the next playa. All of this chain connects into the Clap Park Playa Lake, and then flows east from there out into Yellow House Canyon, just down below Dunbar Lake. And so this, even though we don't see this level of flooding in the urban area that's kind of already built in Lubbock, it absolutely existed before we spent a couple of $1 billion to build this stormwater management system that connected the playas and kind of managed that overflow.
Thank you.
Sure thing. So what that led to was a series of tying these observations back to the ecosystem services idea within the site's V2 rating system, of how we might apply that system to do a better job developing landscapes here in Lubbock and in other urban areas where the playa lakes exist. And so at a site level, this is a very short list of things that are really just tied to how we might address water. Because we are losing so much of our infiltration and recharge of our, even if it's not deep recharge, just the recharge of our upper level of soil. It's really critical at the site level that if we want to preserve those ecosystem functions tied to water and the biodiversity that it can produce, really the city needs to develop kind of site level directives and protocols that address stormwater capture on site as a necessary component of new development, and provide incentives for existing development to introduce that. This can look at like a lot of different things. This could be everything from rain barrels to rain gardens and bio-infiltration ponds on larger projects like commercial developments. But also from a design standpoint, the ability to combine the way we grade our site, so the way we shape the landform on our site, could essentially create miniature playas, these depressions that, while they may not serve all of the water functions, they do concentrate water and allow us to use that water to increase biodiversity of plant life and subsequently animal life, and then the carbon sequestration that that would have without relying on the inputs of our much more kind of scarce imported water systems. But more critically at the planning level, I think Lubbock has really, most people see it as a limitation, but I think that at a planning level, if we were to look at these playa systems and map both the flood areas and where those systems would flow together, and then essentially preserve those areas out of development, to preserve the functions, but also to minimize property damage, and then increase slightly the density of the areas in between those floodways. Not only would we protect the playas and have kind of a less per capita impact, a lower per capita impact on those ecosystems, because density, even though it concentrates a lot of the pollution and we end up using more water, the per capita rates are typically lower when we increase density. But the more exciting thing about this plan was when we look at these kind of linear systems, Lubbock could really become a system or a city that's threaded together by these urban greenways. Imagine these, moderately dense, vibrant neighborhoods that mix housing types, but they're kind of nestled in these playa systems that have these short grass prairie ribbons that could begin to introduce spaces for alternative transportation, either bike and hike trails, light rail systems that could utilize that infrastructure with a much lower impact than our kind of roadway systems do, and then how that could impact the overall health of our cities as well. But with the playas we already have, really some changes in management could really help. And I've talked to Glenda about this some. I know Glenda has a passion project for the prairie dog populations, and I talked with her some about how just some changes in management could provide habitat, excuse me, could provide habitat near those colonies that would introduce predators that could naturally control the prairie dog population, so that the city wasn't going out a couple of times a year to euthanize the prairie dogs to control their population levels. Some exciting news on that front, and I know that y'all have done some projects planting some trees with the Parks Department and with the city. The city just just hired a new parks manager, and our department has had some meetings with him. And one of the first changes that he's making to the park system in Lubbock is minimizing the areas that will be maintained by what we call recreational mowing, mowing that just keeps the maintenance crews busy, but doesn't really serve a lot of purpose other than keeping the grass down. And by not mowing these parks in certain areas, hopefully this will start to provide some opportunities for these plant communities to come back in. And then real quickly, I know I'm getting close to the time if I'm not already over. I did want to talk really briefly about a really exciting project that I've got to work on with the Buddy Holly Hall of Performing Arts and Sciences with my part-time work at Park Hill Incorporated, formerly Park Hill Smith and Cooper. And this is at the Buddy Holly Hall of Performing Arts and Sciences. We had a really great opportunity here to do something unique for the city of Lubbock in having an urban landscape that's very high profile, that we wanted to capitalize on highlighting the beauty of what the native ecosystem landscape would be in this region. So to do this, I did, along with Chad Davis, who is the principal that I worked with on this project, we did a deep dive into the Llano Estacado region plant communities, as well as some of our adjacent ecoregions as well. So the Chihuahuan Desert and Trans-Pecos region, as well as Big Country and the northern reaches of the Texas Hill Country, just to be able to include a little bit more diversity in the kind of tree and shrub category, which we needed for the scale of the project. But not only were we looking at the plant species that were here, but also their associations with each other. We really wanted this to be a designed planting that was designed to be resilient, so that as climate conditions change, as maintenance disturbances happened, for instance, let's say that there was a leak in the irrigation system on the project and they had to go dig up an area to repair that system, that we've designed a system that can essentially self-heal with these native plants from that disturbance in the same way that native ecosystems kind of heal. And so in order to visualize kind of what these would look like through the seasons, we came up with these series of graphics for the Llano Estacado, here for the Chihuahuan Desert, which was not really a seasonal change, but was responsive to rainfall events. Really, these different plants, they were shown here in kind of a post-rainfall situation when the desert plants would respond to that water input. And then for the Big Country and Texas Hill Country systems, kind of showing these changes through from year to year, or I'm sorry, from season to season. We also looked at how the landscape could manage water in a lot more efficient ways. One of the things that's frustrated me to no end is that in a severely arid to semi-arid region like Lubbock, we seem to have an urban protocol that says when we get rain, we should try to get rid of it as quickly as possible to avoid flooding, rather than looking at how we can catch it and hold it and soak it into our landscape, turning our city more into a sponge than an oil slick. So we created different terraces. One interesting thing about this project is it is built in an area that was probably a former playa and was rated as a FEMA floodplain. And so they had to elevate the building site about 7 feet above street level, which actually gave us a lot of opportunities to play with these levels of elevation. But you could see here how these different levels create different spaces for the different plant materials and people to interact with them as well. And then finally, kind of modeling what this designed landscape hopefully will look like in a year or two when it's mature. They've begun planting on this project last month, so we're excited to see kind of where it goes. But this is kind of the rendering of what the main corner at Mac Davis and Avenue J, looking towards the Buddy Holly Hall, would look like in spring, and then summer, fall, and winter. So really celebrating these seasonal changes, not trying to make it this landscape that's, you know, evergreen and perfectly manicured, but you know, we had to make it look like a designed landscape and not just something that we went and scattered seeds. Although we did, to play into that theme of resiliency, we did overseed this project with native seed mixes to build that seed bank that will allow it to kind of self-heal and form that matrix. So that's just kind of another quick look at that. So this ties into those ecosystem services of lower reliance on water inputs, hugely beneficial to native wildlife, pollinators, things like that. As kind of a pilot project for this, we worked with the museum at Texas Tech on their new entry garden space. I don't know how many of y'all have had the opportunity to visit that, but we tested some of these plant communities in that new arroyo space that's been designed. And even through this year, the museum did not irrigate that space at all. and all of the plants went dormant, but we had a late summer, early fall rain system. Maximilian sunflowers came into full bloom. Lots of stuff just really came in without any real problems there. So it's been exciting to kind of see that test site and kind of hopefully what will come to fruition for the Buddy Holly project here. So that's really the end of what I've got there. Stop my share. I'd be happy to answer any other questions that anyone has, or elaborate on any of the kind of topics or points there. Oh, I see some questions over in the chat. I'm sorry with my.
I had a question about well, I don't know if it's it's a question. When I lived in Houston, there was a period where they stopped mowing everything next to the freeways. They just, and it was a program that they called it swales. It was the word that comes to mind, where they were just going to leave it and let it do its thing, or they planted native stuff. Is that what they're looking at doing here in Lubbock? It sounded like you'd mentioned some kind of.
So swales are a stormwater feature. Another word for a swale is a ditch. It's just kind of the more technical term for it.
Okay.
But a certain type of swale is what we in landscape architecture would call a bioswale, which is one that is planted or maintained in such a way that vegetation helps clean the water, purify the water, trap trash, keep it from flowing into aquatic ecosystems, all that. So it's kind of that idea of concentrating water and supporting those plant communities. I haven't heard anything that the park system is really moving that direction. Theirs is really just doing better maintenance by doing less maintenance, or creating better parks by doing less maintenance. Hopefully, we're working with them on some potential research opportunities in the Canyon Lakes area to see what best management and kind of reestablishment of ecosystems, what kind of practices we need to put in place, because obviously you take an area that's been poorly maintained for a long time and you just stop maintaining it, there's a lot of potential for invasive species and things that may not be, mowed down, but aren't necessarily things you want there either. So hopefully we can figure out what those strategies are. But right now it's really just, they're talking about, these vast swaths of, Canyon Lakes park system is 7.5 miles long, and they mow the entire park right now, up until there's like brushland where there's like mesquite and things like that. Hopefully by just mowing those areas that are kind of the people places, around the picnic areas, around the fishing docks, things like that, they save money in maintenance, but also there's the opportunity for native plants to either reestablish naturally, which we've yet to see if that happens, or if we develop new maintenance strategies that maybe begin to reintroduce them.
Cool, thank you.
Sure thing.
I'm wondering about the slides you showed in South Lubbock of the playa flooding.
Uh-huh.
How much of an impact would having a drought like we're having now impact the flooding? Would it mean that we would have less since everything is so low and so dry, or not?
The challenge with that is any playas that aren't connected to one of those storm systems that kind of flow playa to playa, kind of like along the South Loop. As we move into further South Lubbock, they've installed some of those connections, but not all of them. The real challenge is that these playas, even though they can overflow, they're somewhat closed systems by a more traditional definition, and they've developed, the size of the basin has developed in sync with the size of the watershed that's flowing towards it. And as we pave over more of that system, more water is flowing in there than it would have before. So we have more of buffer time-wise after a major rainfall event than we do after a wet year right now, because it's been a drought, but it's a pretty small window. So one, our what we call our 100-year storm, which is now occurring more like every 10 years or less, just because they're based on much longer averages. One 100-year storm could refill the playas to their kind of capacity at this point. And then any additional rainfall event shortly thereafter could begin to cause that flooding again. Luckily, it's not as extreme. The playa that I showed at 114th and Juneau does appear to be one that they've done a better job with kind of the horizontal separation of development from the playa itself. It's a much kind of larger space than some of our, you look at some of the playas, like the one that's, the name is slipping my mind, the one that's just inside the loop on Quaker, that has a little island out in the middle of it. You look at how
Elmore, yes.
Elmore,
Leroy
yes.
Elmore.
I could not think of
That's
it.
our favorite one.
You look at how close development is to that playa versus that one that we looked at that has a lot of kind of rangeland between the street and the houses and the actual basin itself. We're getting a little better, but I think that, that's not universal. There's another one just to the northwest of that playa that Milwaukee, I think it's Milwaukee, runs right through the middle of it, and they separated into these two excavated playas, or not playas anymore, just retention basins that completely destroyed the playa in the process. So we hit the mark on some and we completely miss it on others. So
Thank you.
yes.
Is anything planned for the Hell's Gate area, which would seem to be the most neglected, I guess, area in the city? By Hell's Gate, I mean east and southeast. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's my favorite. I go out there at least once a month, if not more often. So I just went out there and collected a few seeds for another test project that we're doing on campus at Tech a couple of weeks ago before the frost hit. But that area is designated as urban open space, but it is not part of the parks system currently. I don't know that any plans are included for it. And on my selfish side, I kind of hope there are not extensive plans for it, because the city's plans tend to be much, hopefully with the new parks manager, that approach will be different. But the city's plans would be to go in and develop it in some way into park space and not recognize kind of the value of the kind of ecosystem remnants that are there. There does need to be some, I think, not policing, but some control of like the mountain bike the mountain bike community, which I think is awesome that it exists out there, but a lot of new trails are being cut and there's some kind of erosion and degradation problems that are happening. So, working with that community, I think the city could come up with some maintenance strategies. But as far as I know, there aren't any plans in place for the future of that site.
Amen to what you just said.
Have any more questions for Jared?
So how do we as citizens encourage these kind of urban ecological changes to take place at the city level, developers? What can we do?
I think it's got to be a multifaceted approach. I definitely think more citizens need to put pressure on the city to even, I think it's a far reach at this point, just in kind of, the political atmosphere that we're in and kind of a pro-development kind of political mindset that the city has. Maybe it's a far push to put development regulations in place, but lifting some of the restrictions on what types of landscapes are allowed, and what types of landscape maintenance are allowed. There are a few instances of kind of prairie landscapes in Lubbock, and oftentimes they're targeted by kind of code enforcement, to say, oh, well, you need to mow your grass, and there's always this kind of hoopla. But more people pressuring the city to allow that, as well as on, kind of the realm that I work in, landscape designers getting better at designing resilient ecosystem landscapes. I'm sure we're all familiar with the quote unquote xeriscape landscapes that are, red lava rock, one limestone boulder, and a red yucca. And that's kind of marketed by a lot of kind of landscape contractors as this, low water, but it doesn't do a lot for our ecosystem function. We're maybe saving water, but we're not doing a lot else with that land. And so really, either from the design side or as kind of a consumer of design, working with designers who really are willing to kind of implement a vision like that, and then at the same time kind of creating that pressure. My hope is that projects like the museum, like Buddy Holly, will start to show that we don't have to have landscapes that look like, Dallas, but we also don't have to, resort to, desert rock landscapes, that there is a middle ground that allows us to have lush, landscapes that have a lot of biomass in them, a lot of color, a lot of movement, a lot of life, but not a lot of extra inputs in terms of water compared to what we're looking at with our kind of traditional landscapes.
Jared, the main purpose of our Cottonwood Tree Project was to start developing a positive rapport relationship with the city, so that they would know that we're a group of concerned citizens that could put in the work, be willing to volunteer our time and our services to do things to make our city better, rather than just be talking and complaining, and actually showing action. So that's our hope. And I'm glad that you mentioned Colby Van Gundy, our new Parks and Rec manager, because having met with him, do feel there's some hope for seeing some improvement in our city. And as a group, we can continue talking to others and really just be willing to put our efforts into doing something positive. Just the mowing aspect at the parks is huge. To cut out that, I mean, it's gonna make a big difference. You're talking today about the Playa Lakes. You don't know how much we appreciate that. We have a speaker that normally addresses that, but this year we redirected and he spoke about another subject. So we sort of missed out on this. And you, even without even being asked to cover it, this was absolutely perfect. We needed to hear this information about the Playa Lakes, especially for our new trainees, because this is really good information. And
in addition to being a plant and design nerd, I have a soft spot for Playa Lakes, because the cotton farm I grew up on, across the county road from us, there was about a half section of CRP that had a Playa Lake in it. And even though we didn't own it, my brother and I and our cousin, when we were little, we would walk down to the bottom of the playa, and if it was flooded, we would swim in it, and if it was a dry season, we would camp down there. And it was within, visibility of my parents' house, but I just have always had a connection to those systems, and just kind of how dynamic they are. And I mean, they're just rich. They're just really cool systems. So, well,
I would like to ask if you would please run for public office in the near future. And I'm not kidding. We need your vision and your interest and your passion. Thank you for talking to us and sharing this great information and making us aware. The Buddy Holly's beautiful. I can't wait to see things there thriving and showing off what we can do with native plants. It's going to be amazing.
I'm really excited about it. And if you get the chance, you should drive by I know the east side that faces Luca,
Mhm.
and the post office over there has been completely planted.
Yes, I have seen it.
Okay.
I have.
I know that they've kind of, it was, the perimeter of the site was kind of open for a while, but with the recent spike in our COVID numbers and wanting to prevent a construction shutdown, they've started to police the edges of the site to keep too many people from wandering in. But if you're just one
Yeah.
lone passerby,
Yeah.
they
Just
probably aren't gonna.
driving by and to see what you can see is a pretty good. Yeah. Well, do we have any more questions here?
I do. How did the Buddy Holly, how did that come about with the plantings and the urban ecology aspect?
Yeah, so I was really fortunate to get involved with that project, and I can not take credit for the vision that led it to that. The Buddy Holly project for a long time, you know, it's been a project that's been in the work for over a decade in the planning. I think it was first, I think they first started discussion on it back in like 05 or 06. But the principal of the firm that I work with knew that this was a unique opportunity for kind of a high profile landscape that you would have opportunities you might not have where people are wanting to do something a little more safe, because this project was kind of so high profile and everything about it was kind of big and daring and different. He wanted to really showcase, he has a passion for the kind of native landscape like I do. And he, from the get-go, wanted this to be a landscape that showcased the Llano Estacado and our ecosystem and our plant communities, because he knew that some of my research had tied into that when I was in my master's. When they got to that part of the project, he actually approached me to work with that. And really, it was kind of his vision from the get-go that I got to come in and help make reality. So it did take some convincing of the stakeholders and the architects on the project, just because they kind of had their own idea, but he did a really great job kind of selling his passion for this place and this landscape and saying that, you know, Buddy Holly is about Lubbock. This landscape should be about Lubbock, you know? So it was really just his push and kind of, you know, digging his heels in, really that led to it.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Well, Jared, as you get busy down the road on the Canyon Lakes work, keep us in mind for volunteer efforts to pitch in.
I will for sure. The city is working on their 2040 plan right now, and they have they're working through all the codes and everything. They're working on developing a new recommended plant list for the city, and a group of faculty at Tech have been consulted on kind of making some recommendations for that. And along with that, we're hoping to leverage some of that same cohort into hopefully some research and student projects in the Canyon Lakes that maybe start to investigate some of those things. And when you get into those, definitely volunteer labor is always welcome. So I will reach out.
Great. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to thank Jared, and really, really do appreciate you doing this, Jared. You put a lot of effort and thought and into your presentation, and it showed. We really appreciate you.
Well, thank you. I love talking about it. Like I said, I'm a nerd about this stuff. So, and it's exciting to get to share it with people who are also get excited about it too.
Well, you're an excellent teacher. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thanks. And I'll drop my email address. If any of y'all ever have any other questions or want any more information about anything, feel free to shoot me a message and just let me know that you're with this group, and I'll be happy to talk some more.
All right. Well, thank you, Jared. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and we will be talking to y'all soon.
Thank
Bye.
y'all.
Bye.